C tier, it's kinda just whatever. These are the ones I don't really have strong feelings about. I don't seriously adore watching any of them, but especially by the end of this tier, the movies start getting actually pretty good, and I start having really fond memories of watching them. But the tier is 16 movies long, so it'll be a hot minute until we get there. I should also mention though that 6 of the 16 in this tier are from the very last video in this series that I released, the one covering all of the random extra movies from the 1990s, and for those my opinions really have not changed at all, and so I might move past those a bit faster. Anyway, time for movie number 69. Nice.
Life is like a hurricane here in Duckburg.
Well, here's the first movie from the last video. I told you there were quite a few, and DuckTales the movie Treasure of the Lost Lamp is honestly just a really fine movie. It's definitely also a direct-to-VHS movie, and it shares a lot of the same animation issues as The Return of Jafar, but unlike The Return of Jafar, I think as a kid, I would have absolutely loved this movie. I honestly still like it a lot now, and a lot of that is because it reminds me of that bygone era of kids' cartoons that I grew up with. I was not born in the 1990s or even the early 2000s, but I still watched a lot of the stuff from that time, and this movie has so many similarities to those things that it honestly just made me really enjoy watching it the entire way through. This movie definitely has a plot, but a lot of it is just Huey, Dewey, Louie, Baby Daisy, and the genie just kind of goofing around. In pretty much any other context, this would be a sign of a bad movie, but like, DuckTales the movie isn't really trying to do the same thing as anything else in this ranking, you know? It can't really be held to the same rubric. The villain is pretty cool, the ending is basically the same as Age of Ultron's, but just in a superior movie. I like all of the characters, and most importantly, the theme song goes harder than any other song just ever made. I like the movie. It's not very good, but I like it nonetheless, and if you grew up watching anything from this time period, you'll probably like it too. There really isn't much to say.
Now that I have the balls, I will go see the king.
A few inches later.
I'm taking my balls and leaving.
Guys, The Thief and the Cobbler is kind of one of the best movies ever made. Up until like halfway through, and then it kind of falls apart. But it isn't really through any fault of its own. This movie is an incredibly unique situation. It's kind of the movie that never was. So Richard Williams, the guy who made it, tried really hard to get this film out for his whole life, but every time it was released, and yes, there were in fact many times, it just wasn't what he wanted, which is why people on the internet have taken it upon themselves to take the best parts of all of the previous releases and also some unfinished stuff from his own archives to create The Thief and the Cobbler, the re-cobbled cut. And for the most part, it slaps. The whole first half of the movie takes place in the Golden City and follows our two main characters, the Thief and the Cobbler. Jump back, right? What's really interesting about it is that very little actually happens, but it's still one of the most enchanting experiences I've ever had watching a movie. We basically just watch some characters walk around a city for 45 minutes, but the city is so visually creative that it doesn't matter. It's made primarily of checkers, and every shot has a 50-50 chance of devolving into some optical illusion that you just can't look away from. Sometimes you can't even tell if you're looking at a wall or a floor, and it all culminates in what is definitely my favorite scene in any animated movie of all time, and probably in my top 3 movie scenes of all time. It does so much creative stuff that I never would have even thought of doing, and paired with the Scheherazade song, it just creates something so impressive that you really have no excuse to not watch right now. The only thing that really sets up anything plot related during this whole first half is the introduction of the characters themselves, but it makes no difference because both protagonists are so charming in every single scene they're in. I would watch 3 hours of Tack and the Thief just going about their everyday life just like this. The setting is perfect, the music is absolutely beautiful, I like every single character introduced, and at this point this movie had the potential to be top 10 on this list, even in spite of the unfinished animation in some places. How impressive is that? But the rest of the film really lost me. A whole bunch of new bad guys and side characters get introduced, the protagonists start wandering through the desert as they embark on their quest, and now that the charm and magic and wonder has been removed, I am no longer interested whatsoever. And the unfinished animation also becomes a lot more noticeable, probably because there are no longer weird geometric designs and shots that I didn't even know were possible. The last half of the movie's boredom all culminates in a 20-minute-long Rube Goldberg machine that starts with Tak throwing a nail at the bad guy's moving fortress, causing the whole thing to completely collapse, which was cool at first, but at some point it just became too much. I don't know if you can really comprehend how long 20 minutes is when it's all just one Rube Goldberg machine. Again, this isn't really the movie's fault, and this last half still has great parts in it despite all of its flaws. I especially like how after an hour and a half plus of the thief trying to steal the golden balls, he just abruptly gives up and walks away. After all of that, he then decided that it just wasn't worth it, and he walks away into the fog. And I honestly can't think of anything more fitting to say goodbye to his character, and I still think the Grand Vizier's death is the most horrifying I've ever seen, and the first half is easily S tier, top 10 on this ranking, one of the best things ever, can't recommend it enough, love it more than I can describe. But the whole package? It's kinda just whatever, hence why it's in the tier with the same name. I'm glad progress on the recobbled cut is still being made, and there's always the chance that the second half that I now view as boring will slowly become more interesting to me as I can view it more and more like the way it was originally intended to be viewed as time goes on. But even if no more progress gets made and Richard Williams' journey ends here, I'm willing to accept that, because the stuff in here that works justifies its existence more than anyone could ever dare demand.
Space adventure, it's an adventure in space!
It seems incredibly disrespectful to put Space Jam above The Thief and the Cobbler, but I guess that's just how it panned out. If I only had about 2.5 minutes of stuff to say just a couple months ago, you can imagine how little I have to say about it now. The concept definitely shouldn't work, but it's executed well enough and has enough good jokes to make it worthwhile. There are plenty of boring parts, like interestingly enough, the basketball game that was the entire justification for making this film in the first place, but there are also tons of parts that I'm glad I watched, even if I'll probably never think about this movie again after this. Everything with the other basketball players I thought was pretty funny, the Looney Tunes aren't that annoying, and neither was Wayne Knight, which was a pleasant surprise, and I didn't even know Bill Murray was in this movie. Even Michael Jordan's terrible acting added another layer of comedy. The animation blends with the live action pretty well, but nobody cares. No one cares. And you know why? Because criticizing this movie is utterly pointless. This was a movie that was made to be watched mindlessly, and even though I don't really think it's that good, it executes that very well. And for a movie that probably could have gotten away with even less effort put in, I have to commend them for making it as okay as it is.
And what are you supposed to be, some kind of fairy?
Ferngully The Last Rainforest is the most cliche movie of all time. I know I've said that a couple of times at this point, but it's actually true this time. I promise. I don't think there's a single original idea in this film beyond the general concept for it, which granted is pretty good. TLDR, there's this rainforest filled with fairies, and humans used to live there too, but then a volcano erupted and Tim Curry came out of it and scared the humans off. So then the humans come back in present times, but with the goal of chopping the rainforest down, and the fairies barely even know what's going on. I like the very not subtle metaphor that humans have strayed so far from the nature that they came from that they look like just a completely foreign entity. And even though the movie itself doesn't really expand on it as much as I'd like, the surface level ideas are still present throughout, and you know what? I really appreciate that. Movie's still not that good though. I guarantee I can just explain the plot and you'll pretty much get where I'm coming from here. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed love interest is interning for the summer as part of the construction crew destroying this forest, but then the main fairy accidentally shrinks him, and so we get a scene where she looks at all of his human stuff and wonders what it does, which is definitely the Little Mermaid's fault for being too good of a movie. Then he gets brought to the fairy village, where he shows the fairies the wonders of technology, like his Walkman, which is probably still the peak innovation humanity has ever made. Haven't checked anything after 1995 though. Then they fall in love immediately. He starts to feel bad for destroying their home. The liar gets revealed. Oh no. Then he saves the day and stops the humans and kills Tim Curry brutally and violently because yeah, he's been in the background this whole time, and they all live happily ever after. I feel like I don't really need to say that much else. The characters are all pretty flat and boring except for this bat played by Robin Williams, who's just always so eager to kill the love interest guy that I can't help but relate to him, because the process of watching this movie also made me want to kill him.
Buzz off? I'm not buzzing anywhere. No, unshrink me, and I mean now!
The animation is pretty okay, but the songs are just awful. This one in particular, but I can't really bring myself to hate it as much as I should, since this is ground zero for the coining of big-lipped alligator moment. If you really want to know more, just check the last video in this series, which can also be said for the other 3 movies we've done in this tier, which all also came from that video. But for our purposes here, I think that kind of sums it up. It's not a very good movie, and I can't think of anything it does actually better than another movie on this list, but I mean, it wasn't that boring to watch, which counts for something, I guess. Enjoy the next 3 movies, because after that, we're back to more from the last video.
But I am all alone. I am
Yeah, sorry, I still can't really get behind The Land Before Time. It's the only one of Don Bluth's original 3 movies that just doesn't really work for me. I think it's pretty good still. The scene of Littlefoot's mom dying is pretty sad, and the movie actually looks really gorgeous. The sky is never just blue. It seems like it's always sunrise or sunset or maybe some unknown natural disaster is happening. I don't know, it's just always really pretty. Even though pretty much the whole movie takes place in the desert basically, there's still a lot of variety in the landscape that makes things look pretty interesting. But I'm not really a fan of the pacing. I knew exactly where this movie was going, and it didn't really do anything beyond that. Not enough to make it a bad movie, obviously, and I'll take it over Oliver and Company any day, but I'm just not really a big fan of some dinosaurs walking, and that's kind of the only thing that happens. The only part of the whole middle chunk that seriously felt worth watching was the battle with the Sharptooth, because it's the only part of the entire journey where a thing happened. This seems really harsh to say, especially because I know so many people love this movie so much, and I do think this movie has a lot of charm, which is one of the big things that saves it, but I'm just saying it would be saved a lot more if the last like 60% of the movie had more going on and didn't have Sarah in it. The dinosaurs themselves are fine though, some I like a bit less than others, but I sympathize with Littlefoot a lot more this time. I like Petrie, and Ducky is still just as cute as before, although, you know, that cuteness still has an underlying sadness to it, all things considered. Look up Judith Barcy if you really want to, but I don't want to get into it for obvious reasons. I've actually decided to come back in editing here and just add that Ducky is a perfect representation of the person who voiced her, and I almost wish that she wasn't, because that makes the movie and especially the real life story just so much more devastating. I'm not sure why I really felt the need to include this, but it just seemed important, I guess. I have genuinely so little to say about this movie. A lot of Don Bluth's movies are pretty simple, and that's where a lot of the charm comes from. When they're bad, that gives me a lot to talk about, because when they're bad, they are bad. But when they're good, or even just fine like this one, I kinda have nothing to say except this one doesn't really work for me, and this one doesn't really work for me. That's it. It may not be the answer you guys were hoping for, and it's certainly not the answer I was hoping for. I do want to like this movie like everyone else, but after rewatching it for this video, I kind of just confirmed my initial opinion, and I don't really plan on watching it again.
Oh boy, fellas, let's rock the joint.
The Aristocats is the first movie in the Disney Bronze Age, and the drop in quality is very apparent. It starts off well enough. We get some time to get to know this family of cats, and I like all of them. The mom is pretty bland, but the kids are cute, which I feel like is more important. And Edgar is honestly a great antagonist with an incredibly solid motivation. In fact, I probably sympathize with this guy more than I do with the cats. I mean, it's not like he killed them or anything. He was just getting them out of the way so that the rich old lady he's dedicated his whole life to wouldn't give every cent of her net worth to some animals. To be honest, this whole first act where Edgar's plan is unfolding and things start to be set in motion is paced really well. I really enjoyed it. Problem is, the rest of this movie, which is the other 40 minutes, is just this annoying as hell Thomas O'Malley cat helping the other cats get back home, and it is so thoroughly uninteresting. We meet some okay characters along the way, but it isn't enough to make me actually glad I invested the time to watch this movie. Plus, Thomas O'Malley is another example of that all-American, street-smart, certified rhisologist that I mentioned back with Oliver and Company. Thomas is nowhere near as bad as Dodger from that movie, but just the idea behind him and everything he stands for is enough to bother me. At the same time, we're watching Edgar do, like, something, and he kind of just gets tossed around like a punching bag, and he loses everything that made him likable in the first part of the movie. It's just a very unfun experience, and the only thing of note after the 20-minute mark is the Everybody Wants to Be a Cat song, which has the worst Chinese stereotype character on this whole list. I hope you'll forgive me for not completely denouncing the Chinese dance from Fantasia as the most disgusting piece of racism Disney has ever put out, now that we've seen yet another thing that actually competes for that title.
Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Fuyang. Fortune cookie always wrong. Not the hot one.
Obviously, all racism is bad, and any movie that has some should be called out, because it's a product of a time that deserves to and honestly just needs to stay in the past, but you have to acknowledge that there are certain degrees of it, and this is definitely up there. Even the animation seems worse. Do you see this background? Yeah, neither do I really. It feels so lazy, and this isn't the only example. All of the black lines on the characters are nowhere near in the same place one frame as they were in the previous. It's like they couldn't even be bothered. All of the people in this movie just flicker in and out 24 times per second. All of the character designs are worse too, except for Edgar's, and it sure doesn't help that the setting for a lot of the film is one dirt road in the middle of the countryside or another. The only good looking parts are coincidentally the parts with decent pacing anyway, so there isn't even anything to distract me from the boring parts. The Aristocats just feel so unfinished, in all ways. It's not like the movies right before this were super plot focused, they kind of meandered around too, but they had other good things to make up for that and justify those decisions, and this movie just doesn't.
You never break a promise. That's too far.
A Bug's Life marks the boundary between low C tier and high C tier, because even though for Pixar this movie is really disappointing, and from an objective standpoint the plot is definitely lacking, I still find myself having an okay time watching this movie. I've watched it twice during my life, once during a marathon of all of the Pixar movies that I did during lockdown, and once for this series. Both times I was incredibly adamant that I would never watch it again, but I mean, it might be the fact that it's already been close to a year since I last saw it, but I would be fine with checking this one out again. There are very few scenarios where I would end up actually watching it, because 999,999 times out of a million I would think of something better to watch instead and then watch that. But for that one time out of a million where I actually did rewatch A Bug's Life, I can imagine at least not being bored while watching it. The movie still has a ton of glaring issues, the plot is not very interesting, and the whole thing hinges on a liar revealed trope in a way not many other movies do. This wasn't something thrown in. This obnoxious, I can't believe you lied to me after all of this, I never want to see you again cliche is integral to the story, and sadly, Flick making up for his lie and earning back the aunt's trust is sort of the only character development in this movie. And did he even really develop? What did he learn? Don't lie? I know that the film's main theme lies in a different area with the grasshoppers, and I do actually like the grasshoppers a lot, and the moral that if the little guy works together they can overcome the big guy is pretty decent. It's just the way they show it by building a big bird. Big Bird? What? It doesn't really feel like a great movie when I put it like this, does it? But I can't even really think of anything else that even happens over the runtime. Heimlich is the only character I like. The animation is pretty aged, even though the technique Pixar invented to create the ants' smooth exoskeletons was so influential in the field of CGI that it's still used in basically every single movie that uses CGI to this day, which is crazy. And the plot definitely stops me from seriously enjoying this movie, but despite all of that, I was never totally bored. I was never like fully interested, but I was never seriously bored. A Bug's Life is just not worth getting bored about, nor is worth getting really anything about. Even though it's not a terrible movie, let's just say there's a reason I'd only decide to watch it once every million times. Alright, back to the movies from last video. You thought you could escape them for long. Ha, pathetic. Anyway, The Nightmare Before Christmas is really mid. I think it's one of the most overrated Christmas movies, one of the most overrated Disney movies or Disney adjacent movies, and also one of the most overrated just movies. I just don't think it's anything special. The only thing that is special about it is the stop motion, which I will happily admit is amazing. This movie has some of the best stop motion I've ever seen. The characters all have great designs, although sometimes that works against the movie instead of for it, and all of the motions are super fluid. All of the settings and backgrounds are so intricately detailed, and by far my favorite part of the movie is just admiring all of the characters doing stuff, because it makes you think, wow, they had to do this and this and this and this just to make that shot, and it's really cool when you think about it. But the plot is just really not for me. I like the idea of the King of Halloween discovering the joy of Christmas and becoming obsessed with it, trying to determine what makes the whole thing work, only to realize that there is no one thing that makes it work, and it's kind of just Christmas. But the way it's all executed is just not really my favorite. I like the first 15 minutes or so, and I like the song Jack sings in Christmas Town, but after that, the story gets worse, the characters get more boring, the songs become much more frequent, to the point where about a third of the movie straight up ends up being songs, and we also get an antagonist thrown in like halfway through. He's not very interesting, I don't know why he's involved in the story at all, and more importantly, he's one of the only black voice actors in the movie, and his name is a slur. I'm sure I'd like this movie more if I was into horror or scary stuff in general, but I'm really not, and I just wasn't really that into it. If you like it, that's totally fine, and I sort of get it, but outside of the first 3 songs, I'm perfectly fine with slowly forgetting every single thing about this film.
I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted, and if you do not do all these things immediately, I will ruin your life.
The Rugrats movie is definitely not for my age demographic, but I still thought it was pretty good anyway. Kinda like the DuckTales movie, if I had seen this as a kid, I think I would have loved it, and I'd probably be super nostalgic for it now. I mean, I technically did, and it was actually the first movie I ever saw in theaters, obviously on a re-release, but I was about 2 and didn't remember a single thing, and when I watched it back in probably October, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed watching it. I mean, if you cut out a lot of the jokes, which are pretty bad, and also the voice acting, which is acceptable for the main characters because they're babies, but not for anyone else. Everyone talks with this really grating voice, and that, kind of sucks. But I actually like the conflict in this movie. Tommy has a new younger brother, and in a post-Boss Baby world, you might expect that the conflict is Tommy hating him and growing to like him. I know that's what I expected, but it's actually that Tommy was really excited to have a brother, but his brother kept making mistakes. It's actually kind of the whole reason the movie even happens, just the brother making mistakes over and over. So it's actually Tommy's friends who dislike his brother, and Tommy kept defending him over and over again. And the main conflict is Tommy separating himself from his friends, and I think that's a pretty interesting way to approach this story. Eventually, Tommy does end up breaking, but instead of this scene feeling tropey or cliche, it actually feels earned and honestly pretty sad. I was surprised how nuanced and subtle these toddlers were, and I was also really surprised when I realized that I had just watched 90 minutes of babies stranded in the forest, and I wasn't actually bored. The Rugrats movie is definitely not for my age demographic, and the age demographic it is for does not care about these things. The first time I watched this movie, I was the age demographic it's for, and I don't even remember it, but that makes it even more impressive that they put in the effort to make this movie decent anyway.
사랑해.
Mickey!
사랑해요.
Mickey!
사랑합니다.
Fun and Fancy Free is another World War II package film. One 40-minute short that sucks, and one 40-minute short that is objectively the greatest thing ever made. But it's still the second worst of these package films. The first one is really bad. So the Bongo story is basically about a circus bear who escapes captivity to live in the woods. Sounds okay, but the story stops with that basic idea. Nothing happens in the woods, and it keeps not happening for 40 minutes. We just watch him get used to the forest, and we see him try to jump for the first time. Oh no, he fell. Silly Bongo. It's too bad none of your literal award-winning acrobatics from last week transfer over to any of these situations. Then we watch him climb a tree. Oh my. Silly Bongo. You can't walk up trees. It's too bad he got amnesia when he jumped off the train and forgot about gravity. Then we watch him drink water. It's honestly kind of concerning that Bongo forgot about water. I mean, the forest looks really nice, and that's not surprising considering the whole point of all of these older movies is to give audiences some nice colors to look at because everything in real life was in black and white back then. But when has nice animation alone ever been enough to keep me interested in anything, let alone Bongo's stupid quest to survive his first night in his new Minecraft world? The other old movies have things besides animation. The scenes in those movies that don't move the plot along have charm in some other way, like with cartoony interactions between likable characters, but Bongo doesn't have any of that. Then the second half of the short is Bongo meeting some new bears. We meet a love interest bear who has no personality of her own because at this point in American culture, women were still basically just objects. Because of that, this WWE bear also loves the unnamed love interest bear, and so there's a conflict that ends with the WWE bear immediately falling down a waterfall and dying painfully. But even that wasn't interesting at all. Literally the only good part of this entire short is the song the bears sing about how they slap each other to show their love, because it just comes across as promoting domestic abuse because it's so ridiculous and poorly aged. Oh, he thought that unnamed girl bear 5-starring him was a red flag. Silly Bongo. Everyone knows that physical violence against your significant other is clearly the only path forward in every situation. Nothing happens, every song is sung with a choir in the exact same style, and it immediately stops being interesting. There are a lot of weird reused shots and character motions, sometimes even within like 2 minutes of each other. And did I mention nothing happens? Fortunately, the second short is way better. Not only is Mickey and the Beanstalk phenomenal, but it's also a staple of my childhood. Not the version in this movie with the creepy puppets and live-action kids who everyone universally hates, but the version from 1963 that's narrated by Professor Von Drake. But honestly, even with some, let's be generous, subpar narration, the story itself still slaps. Mickey, Donald, and Goofy in a story together has never gone badly. Actually, it probably has. There's probably some racism in the history somewhere, but like, that I've seen, it's never gone badly. And the fact that this retells a good story helps too. Willie the Giant is an amazing villain. The measures they go to save this harp and avoid detection are great and so entertaining. This giant food looks delicious. The movie in general just looks breathtaking. The songs are fantastic, and I remember and love every single one. It's one of the first movies chronologically that gave us memes. There's a point where Donald and Goofy sing the Spider-Man 2 pizza song because they think they're finally gonna escape poverty. It literally has everything a short could possibly have. Well, the 1963 version does. The version in this movie happens to have exactly one issue, and I'll let you guess what it is. The only thing of quality in any of these scenes is the part where the nerd emoji puppet dresses up as a pirate and looks uncannily like Johnny Depp. Half of this short is D or F tier, but the other half is easily S tier, and it balances out to create a movie that's kind of middle of the road. Pretty whatever, and I highly recommend that you watch 50% of it.
Wasteland? I think you mean Wonderland!
You know, this time around, I was really hoping I'd like Alice in Wonderland, but no, not really. I mean, I like it a lot more than I did, but this movie still just isn't really for me. It's just not the sort of movie I like the most, but credit where credit is due, it does what it's trying to do very, very, very well. The animation is fantastic, not just in the normal Silver Age, oh look, everything is super detailed way, but in the insane creative way that this movie does best. There's always something cool to look at, and there are a ton of scenes where you can tell the animators were allowed to just try stuff. Problem is, that can only keep me interested for so long. I've come to appreciate the scenes in these older movies that are just showing off some animation or letting some random scene play out without anything really happening. A lot of the time, it's those scenes that give the movies their charm, and walking away from them with your only thought being, what was the point of that, just isn't very productive. But what makes those movies different from this one is the simple fact that those movies had plots. They had scenes without plot, but it didn't matter because the movie still had a plot. But beyond I Want to Get Home, this movie is kind of just meander around, meet a character, meander around, meet a character, meander around, meet a character, and without any direction to the story, I just wasn't able to stay at 100% interest the entire time. Granted, there have been a lot of movies before this where I haven't even been able to become interested at all, so the fact that I'm almost 100% interested almost most of the time in this movie is pretty good, but still, it's just not the best, you know? Some of the characters we meet are good, and a lot of the scenes that go with them are good too. The Cheshire Cat is great, I like the scene with the walrus and the carpenter just for how dark it is. Everyone loves the Mad Hatter, all of the scenes with the Queen of Hearts are fun, and there are tons of other iconic scenes I like that I haven't even mentioned. But for everything this movie does that's interesting or made me enjoy myself, there are two things where I'm kind of just sitting there checking how much of the movie I have left. A lot of the stuff is really memorable, and it makes me really like those scenes, but a lot of it is kind of just waiting to get to those scenes, and it balances out to put it here. We'll get to this more in later parts of this video, but movies like Snow White and Pinocchio are paced in a way that they seriously feel like feature-length cartoons. But in a movie like this, that idea kind of falls apart. Your average 10-minute Mickey Mouse short has more moving the narrative forward than this 80-minute feature film, and in a situation like that, sometimes I'm just not gonna be a fan. Like, this movie has the most songs out of any Disney movie, with 14. That's a disgusting amount, and in any other context, it would make me want to cast myself into a sinkhole, or rabbit hole, I guess. But here, they just serve as a respite from having to watch basically the same filler content over and over and over again between the couple of scenes that I really like, but I hate to be all negative when the movie still has a lot of good stuff about it, so I'll end off by saying that I like Alice more this time. Last time I thought she was kind of annoying, and she definitely still is, but like, she was less annoying this time. Well, now that I think about it, maybe she's just the same. I'm really trying, guys. I guess I just don't like this movie as much as I was hoping. If you do, that's awesome, and I can totally see myself growing to love this movie in the future. But as of right now, I never plan on watching this again. Oh yeah, and apparently it was all a dream, so what was the point of the last 90 minutes of my life?
Jack Frost.
All of those old Rankin and Bass Christmas movies are classic. They're staples of everyone's childhood, and for good reason. They're awesome. There's only one that I think is just okay, and that's Jack Frost. It's still not bad, which is why we were able to go for 34 movies before getting to it, but compared to pretty much everything else they made, it's noticeably less entertaining. It just doesn't really have the sauce, which is an incredibly subjective statement, but still, I just can't really see any passion behind this movie. Most of the characters are pretty bland. Jack sees a human girl once and immediately falls in love, so he petitions the god of winter to turn him human so that he can be with her. This is all before they ever speak, by the way. It's not that boring, and I think seeing Jack get excited about having an itchy nose for the first time and stuff like that is pretty cute, but the villain is kind of boring. If Kublai Klaus or whatever his name is genuinely your favorite Rankin and Bass antagonist, fine, but compared to this guy or even this guy, it becomes even more obvious how sort of bland he is. The movie definitely has good things. The stop motion is pretty good, and the character designs and sets are all really great, and a ton of the songs are super memorable, some for bad reasons, but others for really good reasons. The fact that Jack Frost made it this far up the list should tell you that it's not a bad movie, but the fact that it's not any farther up should tell you that it's not a great one. If you're looking for something to watch next Christmas, check this one out, but only if you've exhausted all better options. Dumbo might be the most racist thing Disney has ever made, or at least the second most. And before we talk about anything else regarding this movie, we need to talk about that. So, toward the start, there's this song. It's called the Song of the Roustabouts, which is a bunch of faceless black workers singing about how they're inferior to white people and don't know what to do with their money, and so they just spend it on useless stuff because they're black. So what else are they gonna do with it, you know? And one of them gets called a hairy ape, which has to be the worst lyric I've ever heard in a song. Throw caution to every warning sign and watch out world, here I are fun to make fun of, but they obviously cannot be compared to this. This is just so unbelievably horrible. There's also a song sung by a bunch of crows who are very clearly meant to be black, but guess what? None of them are voiced by black people, but Jiminy Cricket sure is pretending to be. Uh-oh. And paired with the clothes and the fact that the main crow's name is Jim, as in Jim Crow, like Jim Crow, it's kind of just really awful. The fact that Make Mine Music still isn't on Disney Plus because there's a short where people have guns. Meanwhile, this is on there just fine, despite being infinitely more malicious, is absolutely ridiculous. How is it that the one movie Disney made that's directly about accepting people who are different than us follows that exact message the least of any movie in the entire Disney canon? Alright, now we can talk about the rest of the movie. The actual plot starts in the last 5 minutes, so even though the movie is only an hour long, nothing happens for 95% of that hour, so the movie is still just nothing. But even though it doesn't exactly move the plot forward, the last 25 minutes or so are better, with Baby Mine, Pink Elephants, and the Crow song all back to back. Dumbo doesn't really have any traits and just kind of lets stuff happen to him, although he is pretty cute as a baby. Jiminy Cricket, but as a mouse, serves exactly the same role in this story as actual Jiminy Cricket does in Pinocchio, except worse. Those are honestly the only two characters with any screen time now that I think about it. No wonder this movie can feel so long sometimes. The idea of a bunch of old ladies acting like high school mean girls towards a literal infant is kind of ridiculous, but it makes all of the scenes where they exclude Dumbo so much funnier. They take a solemn vow to expel him from the species, and that's the greatest thing I've ever heard. Also, I'm surprised how much of this movie's music I remembered and liked. The Stork song holds up and I like it. The Casey Jr. song holds up and I like it. When I See an Elephant Fly doesn't hold up in the slightest, but is also still a good song musically speaking. That other song with all of the racisms holds up even less and also sucks in its own right. And Baby Mine is actually pretty sad and very impactful. But Pink Elephants though, undeniably one of the coolest sequences in any animated movie ever made. So visually creative, such amazing music, such an overwhelming sense of I am definitely hallucinating right now. It has zero reason to be in the movie. For all intents and purposes, it's technically a big-lipped alligator moment, but that makes it even better. You straight up can just watch this scene totally out of its original context, because there is no original context. It's just there, and it's freaking awesome. Other than Pink Elephants though, nothing special is happening here animation-wise. There are some nice shots from the train at the beginning, but even that doesn't really show anything super new. It's just kind of boring, much like a lot of the movie itself. But a lot of it is actually pretty surprisingly entertaining. I'd like to think I appreciate the charm of the Golden Age movies more now. After all, I watched Snow White for the first time for this series, and now I feel sort of nostalgic toward it just 2 years later, and that's gotta mean something. But you know what movie I feel nostalgic towards slightly less? Dumbo. I mean, it's still only an hour long, and there are enough scenes that I really like, basically any scene with a song, that it still managed to get placed this high. But its troubled production is definitely noticeable here.
When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore.
If A Bug's Life was the boundary between low C tier and high C tier, Lady and the Tramp is the boundary between high C tier and some level of other higher C tier, because now the movies are genuinely pretty awesome. Lady and the Tramp is actually really cute and enjoyable, and considering that it's just a dog getting excluded from her family and then a dog showing another dog around a city and then two dogs falling in love, it's a miracle how cute it manages to be. The romance works surprisingly well, and I like both of the main dogs. Except for the Italian stereotypes, this spaghetti scene is honestly great and one of the best parts of the movie, and compared to the Siamese cats scene, and especially compared to Peter Pan, which came out right before this really isn't that bad at all. It's also paced really well for the most part, always bringing in new plot elements when things get a bit stale. Sure, half an hour of two dogs walking around and doing stuff isn't peak content, but when you remember Oliver and Company, you start to realize that for what it is, maybe it's closer to peak content than you'd think. I like all of the side dogs, and the fact that I was able to remember both of them and the old reliable joke should tell you how much they not only don't suck, but also probably improve the movie. All of the dogs at the pound are sort of forgettable, and that's also the only part of the movie that falters pacing-wise, so I guess that makes sense. This movie really is not that complicated. It feels like it's saying way less than your average Cinderella or Pinocchio, but that's okay, because Disney isn't trying to pretend like it is. They just let this be a romance between two dogs, and it's leagues better than the two that were made right before it. But by far the best part of this movie is the animation. There's only one movie between this and the rise of Xerox pencil sketch animation, which means that Disney was at the top of their game here. This scene at the end with the carriage chase through these wet, slushy roads impresses me just as much as it did 2 years ago. Plus, all of the neighborhoods look great too. All of the houses and trees on these streets are just straight up beautiful. The colors, the architecture, everything. Apparently this place is based on Walt's childhood home, and honestly this street really does feel like a sort of nostalgic, perfect version of a neighborhood. Meanwhile, the other parts of the city look amazing. The interiors of all of the houses look amazing. The designs of all of the dogs look amazing. The fact that they basically had to make this movie twice, once for widescreen and once for full screen, is amazing. It's all just so impressive, and it creates one of the only Disney movies that I seriously will just watch for the animation. Something that even Alice in Wonderland, a movie that was made for that exact purpose, essentially couldn't do. Obviously Sleeping Beauty, the next movie chronologically, has all of this awesome stuff too, and probably even does it better. Plus it has a way better story, which is why it's so much higher, but that doesn't negate the sheer talent that was clearly behind making this movie. Talk about a movie that knows what it was trying to do. And if it wasn't for the Siamese cats thing and the pound stuff, I literally have no issues with it. The fact that the first 30 minutes of this movie is just a dog watching its owners prepare to have a baby, the fact that that is somehow fully entertaining the entire way through should really say it all. Again, essentially no issues here. Actually, that's a lie. For some reason, they chose to draw the baby as part of the background instead of as a character, and so it looks horrifying in every scene. This is like the precursor to the Twilight baby. Like, why would you do this?
Adios, Hollywood, and saludos, amigos.
Saludos Amigos is the first World War II package film, and its purpose of we're being told to spread knowledge of Latin America to the United States for alliance reasons is incredibly clear, but I still kinda like this movie anyway. Yes, it's incredibly obvious that this movie started as an all-expenses-paid vacation from strikes and war back in the United States, and the fact that this film still starts with a racism warning despite being entirely about depicting the culture of South America in a truthful way is very ironic, and would almost suggest that their hearts may not have been in the right place. But for every suspicious and poorly aged thing, there are quite a few things that really make it seem like the people working on this genuinely cared. A quarter of the movie is just a documentary. I never really liked this part because it's not animation, and that was the only reason I was ever watching it at all. But in retrospect, the fact that they put this in makes their depictions of South America in this movie feel a lot more genuine. After all, it seems way easier to skew the truth in an animation left entirely up to white people to decide every aspect of than it is in raw camera footage. What you see in these documentaries is a lot harder to fabricate, and it does make the idea behind this movie feel a lot more earnest than it otherwise would have. There are 4 shorts in this movie, and I don't hate any of them, but some are definitely better than others, so let's rank them. Number 4, the one with Goofy. The concept is that he's a cowboy from like Arizona who gets launched across the world into South America, where the narrator dresses him up as a gaucho, educating the audience about gauchos along the way. There's still a comment I don't really like where the narrator spends like 2 minutes going through each piece of clothing and explaining what it is, and then he goes, and then we have the poncho, which just covers everything anyway. And it's like, why'd you phrase it like that? There's obviously significance behind all this stuff, but just the way he says it feels weird to me. Maybe I'm going crazy though, I don't know. This movie definitely has some racism in it, but nowhere near as much as you'd think. And even this one, the worst one, is mainly last just because it's boring. Number 3, the plane one. Anthropomorphizing the male planes that they saw while in South America is actually a cool idea that shows genuine interest and care about maybe not the culture, but at least the way of life of the people of that region. This one is definitely more plot-oriented than animation-oriented, and not much really happens plot-wise anyway. It's just a plane flying around, but that's fine because Pedro is really cute and his mission to collect the mail is really endearing. Plus, this part is very funny.
Their brave little son was gone. Another martyr to the mail service. Poor little fellow.
What the hell does that line imply? Pretty enjoyable, but the other two are just better. Number 2, the Lake Titicaca one, which is actually improved by Donald's inclusion, unlike the Gaucho one, which would be unchanged if Goofy wasn't in it. It's hard to tell what's racist and what's just your standard cartoon exaggeration of reality that would still be present regardless of the race of the people in said cartoon. I don't really know how accurate any of this is, but from an outsider's perspective, which I definitely am, it seems way less malicious here and more of an opportunity to actually explore Incan culture. Donald playing an Incan flute badly and making a llama mad feels like something that would still happen if the flute wasn't Incan and the llama wasn't Incan and Donald wasn't in the Incan Empire. You know what I mean? And all of the chaotic nonsense that Donald always gets up to is actually fun to watch. Rope bridge shenanigans are always entertaining, and I think that this short as a whole is pretty good. And number 1, Aquarela do Brasil. This one is just straight perfection. It's the first time Disney ever used the ethereal paintbrush creating the environment technique, and it looks so great. The painting part, the backgrounds that get painted, the bananas that turn into toucans, the characters interacting with the environment, everything. Joe isn't a harbinger of dancing live-action women yet, the music is catchy as hell, and that last shot of the movie zooming out is simply iconic. Saludos Amigos has some crummy stuff in it for sure. If it was really that great, well, it'd be ranked higher than number 55, but the stuff it does right is actually really good, and it shouldn't be ignored. Watch Aquarela do Brasil on YouTube or something, the rest you can check out if you really want to, and it's still infinitely better than the Three Caballeros.
Wait, where are you going? Alaska! It's faster if you drive.
Balto is a really tropey movie, but it's a really well-made tropey movie. Sure, it has a lot of issues. The pacing falters quite a bit. Balto isn't that interesting of a character, and neither is this villain dog. And that makes the first 20 minutes or so, where absolutely nothing happens, really boring. I wouldn't be surprised if tons of people just turned this movie off after those first 20 minutes, because based just off those, the chances of it being a passable movie looked pretty grim, but then the plot actually started, and the movie became actually pretty good? What? This is an adaptation of the story of that dog team that delivered diphtheria medicine 600 miles across Alaska to save all of the dying children who had no other chance of living. If the movie had kept up the way it was going, this would probably have been the second most disrespectful adaptation in history after The Sea of Monsters. But surprisingly, it actually treats the threat of these dying children with all of the severity that the situation demands. There's definitely some slight tonal whiplash from going from Balto wins a race to parents hug each other and sob because they know their daughter is going to die. But it's a welcome change because A, it gives the movie a direction to move in, and B, it gives me something to care about. There are definitely some filler obstacles on the dog's journey back to Nome, like one of them sneezing and starting an avalanche, which really? But the tension stays until the very end. Also, the side characters who would normally be annoying actually aren't. I like the Russian goose, and these polar bears are hands down the best characters in any movie, and they deserve merch that doesn't look like absolute garbage. And this movie looks really beautiful too. The character designs are good, but the backgrounds are great, and even the most boring scenes at least have something nice to look at. And I love the way that they drew the bear in this one scene with just orange and blue highlights. It looks like a monster from hell, and it makes this random action scene feel seriously threatening. By far the best part of the movie. If I ever rewatch this one, I'm definitely going to be skipping past some parts, but it's still a pretty good movie nonetheless, and is certainly deserving of being the highest movie in C tier. On to B tier. B tier, pretty enjoyable. We have now gotten past any movies that I have doubts about. From here forward, I like every single movie. I would happily watch any of these movies. If you were to put on any of these movies, I would just think, oh, okay, I know that movie. That's a good movie. Hell yeah, I'll watch that movie. Not all of them are stars, watch out world, here I are's, but by the end of this 15 movie tier, or honestly just by the halfway point of this tier, things start to really get good, although admittedly this next movie is this high for a completely different reason.
So, nerd, I hear you want to be a big ladies' man.
The Pebble and the Penguin, I think is my favorite movie of all time. Not to watch, but just to think about. Realistically, this is just your average guy gets swept away from his home, guy meets other guy, the two guys try to get back to their home together, guys become friends movie. But this movie also has my absolute favorite movie character literally ever. This isn't sarcasm like it usually is. Drake the Penguin, played by Tim Curry, is without a doubt the greatest character I've ever seen in any IP in the history of humanity. I'm dead serious. His entire motivation is that there's only one girl penguin on the entire island, and he feels threatened by the main character, even though he really shouldn't, and so he proceeds to humiliate the main character and then throw him off a cliff, at which point he falls into the ocean and ends up on a ship that deposits him in like Australia. But all of Drake's mannerisms in this scene are just so funny to me. You know how Tim Curry is like British? Yeah, for some reason he's trying to put on an American accent, and it's about the worst American accent I've ever heard. It's just so ridiculous that it completely takes you out of the movie, and it just makes him feel like the bully in a high school movie. It's just so weird, and it all culminates in my favorite line, which is one of the only things that I actually quote frequently in my everyday life.
So, nerd, I hear you want to be a big ladies' man.
The way he says this is so utterly, aggressively inhuman. Every inflection is in the wrong place. Every syllable sounds like it's being pronounced by someone who's never spoken English before. And you can tell he's so focused on not being British that he can't even spare a second to make it seem like a human being is saying the line.
Ladies' man.
Who pronounces it like that? Ladies' man. The reason I'm emphasizing this so much is because the movie has basically nothing else going on. It's a good thing that the main plot is okay, because otherwise not even Tim Curry could elevate the film above like D tier, but the main character's quest to get back to Antarctica was actually surprisingly enjoyable. His dynamic with the angry penguin is actually present and really good too. They actually make jokes and bounce off of each other really well, and it makes it not really matter that for a lot of the movie nothing really happens. The songs are all also pretty good. The opening song that introduces us to all of the characters has them swimming through sheet music, which is really cool. Drake's villain song sucks, but that makes it even better. The Good Ship Misery song is really catchy, but I still only remember it for this one scene where every single character is frozen in time. And the Oh Look at Us, the two main characters have truly come together song, surpasses all of those because of its conclusion that takes 30 seconds to get through 2 words.
Looks like I got me.
And some of that was sped up too, and except for the unfinished parts in a few places, the animation is actually also pretty good. I wish the penguins didn't have fingers because that's very uncanny, but the backgrounds are really good, the character designs are mostly decent, and the color choices make things a lot more enjoyable to look at. The movie would probably still be in C tier without Drake. It's still a pretty enjoyable experience, but with Drake, I've probably spent more time watching and quoting and thinking about this one clip than I have actually watching or thinking about or whatever the whole movie. I had to at least put it in B tier.
So, nerd, I hear you want to be a big ladies' man.
I had to do it one more time, I'm sorry.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Yeah, I still don't really get Only Yesterday, but it's still a really great movie though. So the movie's all about this little girl, Tycho, and the challenges she faces growing up. It's basically a series of vignettes showing us her life, and each one makes us more depressed than the last. It starts out pretty tame, but by the end we feel so seriously bad for her and sympathize with her so much. The family that just seemed normal at first is now insufferably terrible to her. Tycho can't divide fractions. They all proceed to have a discussion about how she might have a mental disability. After all, she was dropped as a child on the other side of the room where she can clearly hear them, so her sister is tasked with helping her, and this character cannot rationalize how a child doesn't understand something, and she rushes downstairs to complain to her mom, at which point her mom screams that Tycho is clearly not a normal child. And this scene where they both realize that Tycho is actually standing right there and they slowly turn around has more tension than anything in any movie we've seen so far on this list. I'm dead serious. Only Studio Ghibli could make something like this, to be honest. Even the smaller stuff, like her minuscule part in the play where she has just one line, is presented in such a way that it clearly means something. And I'd say this culminates with, spoilers I guess, Tycho's dad hitting her. If we weren't sympathizing with her before, how about now? This is by far the most effective scene of someone crying in an animated movie, I think, ever. It's one of the most real and genuine sounding things I've ever heard, animation or not animation, and it actually makes me curl up inside because of how pure it sounds. So what problem do I have with this film? Apparently, all of this isn't actually the point of the movie. The movie is actually about Tycho as an adult taking time off from her job to go work on a safflower farm. what the hell? And along the way, she either has flashbacks or tells stories to the people on the farm. That's how all of those vignettes, which are actually good, factor into the real story. And it's like, why couldn't the movie just be about the other stuff? Because I hate to say it, but a lot of the present day stuff kind of just is not that interesting. There are about 20 minutes total of Tycho and this organic farming guy sitting in cars and talking about the stuff in the past when the movie could have just been about the past. And to make matters worse, there's actually a scene where Tycho mentions her dad hitting her and basically says, it's okay, I probably deserved it. I was being a bratty child. What? That's what you want us to take away from this? She basically says that she wants to stop feeling sorry for herself like she always used to as a kid and do something with her life, which would be a fine message if everything we saw of her childhood wasn't totally and utterly traumatizing. Both of these stories, yes, probably even the present day one, could probably work on their own, but combined into one movie? I don't really think so. The connections between these two stories aren't just tenuous, but actively weaken both stories and what they're trying to say. Like I said when I reviewed this originally, there could be a big element of the story that I'm just missing. If I am, please tell me, because if there's something that could make me fully understand and like this movie, it'd probably be at least 20 spots higher. The stuff that works really well, but the way it is now, I'm just not really the biggest fan. That vignette toward the start about puberty and harassment and having a crush on someone was great. The vignette about dividing fractions is great. The crows are flying away, look, is great. I could go on, and I'd vastly prefer a movie with more stuff like that and less sitting in cars and sitting in fields and sitting in cafes, talking about how all of the good parts of the movie don't actually matter. There are some absolutely devastating scenes in this movie, but I think that the most devastating ones might actually be these, because they're just showing us firsthand the masterpiece that we could have had.
At jamesandthegiantpeach.com, you can look at giant peaches of all shapes and sizes from all around the world. I love big peaches.
For a movie that I distinctly remember giving me nightmares as a 4-year-old, I'm surprised how much I've come to like James and the Giant Peach. I mean, I totally get why this movie scared me as a kid. The stop motion may be insanely impressive, but that just makes the eldritch horror character designs even more terrifying to a little kid. But now that I'm not so little of a kid anymore, I can appreciate how this movie's uniqueness makes it one of the most charming movies I've ever seen, and I honestly might end up raising it in the rankings soon. It grows on me a bit more every time I think about it. This movie is basically as follows. James is being raised by his two aunts, who are the most delightfully evil people ever, and to no one's surprise, it kind of takes a toll on this poor child's mental health. But then he meets this strange man who gives him some magic mushrooms, which he proceeds to spill all over the ground, causing a giant peach to grow on this tree. Some other stuff happens, and James ends up inside the peach, at which point he turns into stop motion and meets a bunch of giant bugs. The rest of the film is James getting to know the bugs as they fly the peach to New York City. And I don't know, I think it's really cute. We get to spend a little bit of time with each of these bugs, and by the end, we have at least a little bit of emotional attachment to all of them. Sure, they looked scary at the start, but that was by design so that the audience's realization that they actually aren't that scary at all is more impactful. And what we're left with is a really great story about a bunch of people who think they're unwanted coming together and becoming friends. And as they all grow closer together, they start to realize how similar they all are. And if they aren't so bad, hey, maybe I'm not so bad either. And so all of them start to see their own worth that way, which is why when the movie ends with James making a big speech to his aunts about how he's not worthless, not only does it not suck, but it actually feels sort of cathartic. And it's definitely helped by how good the pacing is. In between scenes where the characters get to know each other, there are little filler scenes where a random obstacle has gotten in the way of their quest, which they have to work together to deal with, ranging from mechanical ships that get no explanation to a graveyard of ships haunted by the ghosts of its crew that also gets no explanation. It's all weird, but in a really inventive way that keeps things fresh and interesting. And so when I found out that this was originally a book by Roald Dahl, the Willy Wonka creator himself, I was not shocked in the slightest. This movie perfectly sums up why I'm so glad I started this series. Not only has it exposed me to a ton of high quality movies that I probably never would have seen otherwise, but it's also made me rewatch movies that I used to not like and helped me realize that, hey, maybe I do like them. If not for this series, I would have gone on thinking that James and the Giant Peach was a bad movie for the rest of my life. But if you're watching right now, which I know for a fact you are, otherwise how are you hearing this? Don't make the same mistake as me. Watch James and the Giant Peach. It's actually really fun.
Winnie the Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, chubby little cubby all stuffed with fluff. He's Winnie the Pooh.
Hey, movie number 50. Anyway, I really liked The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh back in 2022, and you know what? I still really like it now. It's incredibly easy to like. I'm obviously not in love with it, but in terms of what this movie was trying to do and what and who it was meant for, it's probably like a 9 out of 10. It's honestly just a really solid movie. It's cute as hell, it looks super amazing, and did I mention how cute it is? Xerox animation seriously was made for this film. All of the thick black outlines in the background fit here. Normally it just feels kind of like an excuse to skip out on extra details, but considering that this is as storybook as a movie can possibly be, the entire setting suits it really well here. Plus there are so many creative storybook details everywhere. The way the words of the book interact with the characters obviously being the biggest one. I know that tons of these old Disney movies start with some sort of book opening up, but this is one of the only ones where it feels like you're actually reading that book the whole way through the movie. And of course it feels like that because it zooms out to show the page flipping every 2 minutes. All of the characters seem to realize on some meta level that they're in a story, and it works in some really cool ways. The entire conflict of this movie's third short gets resolved by the narrator rotating the book 90 degrees, and that's really cool. Talking about any of the characters seems kind of pointless because if I spent any amount of time trying to analyze Winnie the Pooh, it would be an objective waste of all of our lives. We all know what these guys are like, and they're portrayed perfectly in this movie. Every single one of them makes me smile, and every scene is just so cute and charming. I don't even know if there's a point of really going into the plot of the 3 different shorts in this movie either, because they're straight up just Winnie the Pooh stories. I don't really have problems with any of them because this isn't really a thing people have problems with. Actually, Winnie the Pooh would never eat rabbit's honey like that. It's a complete betrayal of his character. I'm literally shaking and crying right now. This is you if you're saying that. It just doesn't matter. The one with the honey tree is cute. The one with the rainstorm is cute. And the one with the Tigger is cute. That's all of them. That's all 3. They're all cute. Big surprise. Any of my criticisms with this movie would kind of be nullified just because of what this movie is, so then I guess it works out that I didn't really have any issues to begin with. This movie is clearly not meant for people my age, but I still like it a lot and think it's really charming anyway. Younger kids will love this movie, teenagers like me will love this movie, adults will love this movie, and old people who've lived through both world wars will love this movie. It's not a movie with themes or anything, but it still makes you feel happy, and making you feel things is kind of the point of any movie, right? Originally, I thought that Robin Hood was a movie with nothing worth talking about, but honestly, a year and a half later, my opinion has completely turned around. I mean, I still think it's just like okay, but I definitely like it a lot more. But we might as well start off with something I don't love because I'm a miserable and negative person. Unlike Winnie the Pooh, this is a great example of a movie that suffers from Xerox pencil animation. It feels like the grand story of Robin Hood, the noble thief who steals from the corrupt king and gives to the poverty-stricken residents of Nottingham, would be very well suited for a more Sleeping Beauty sort of style. I think a lot of the character designs still work, but I can't really get very interested in the setting because I just don't think it looks that great. I guess you could say it looks like a storybook, in which case maybe it does make sense, like we said with Winnie the Pooh. But in this case, I still think I'd prefer pre-Xerox animation. Sleeping Beauty also opens with a storybook, and its animation is perfect the way it is. The movie still looks fine, and there are some really nice looking parts, but I can't shake the feeling that it could look better, which is a nice transition into some lazy bits of animation in this movie. One in particular, which everyone knew I was going to mention at some point, the phony King of England scene where everyone is dancing, I don't think has a single piece of original animation in it. I'll put a side by side on the screen right now, credit goes to this person. Most of it comes from the Jungle Book, but some of it comes from the Aristocats, which came out literally right before this movie, and some even came from as far back as Snow White in 1937, and Little John is literally just a recolored blue. Watching this scene, and honestly the whole movie, knowing all these things makes it so hard to pay attention sometimes, because once you start seeing it, it's really painfully obvious. Like, these are some pretty distinct looking animals, and this is a pretty distinct looking dance. If you're gonna make a scene where everything is taken from somewhere else, I almost have to ask, like, is there even a point to making it? At least the fight choreography is pretty good, but other than that, this movie is nothing special in terms of the animation. Luckily, the story is much better and much more enjoyable for me now. Robin Hood isn't that great of a character, and the only thing worth mentioning about him is the fact that he's furry ground zero, and his relationship with Marion still isn't the most interesting to me either. I'm not sure if that's a controversial opinion, but it's definitely the opinion I have.
Now you're all grown up inside of me.
I like Little John, and Prince John is a decent antagonist. There are a lot of people named John in this movie. I like him, he has some personality and some actual traits. I like the little snake guy, I like the sheriff, and together they actually work as a really good obstacle. They make a point to show us that this guy is the most detestable and despicable monster to ever live, and it works. I hate this guy, and I also hated watching all of these movies in quick succession and noticing how many of them this guy is in, because he has the most like distinct voice out of any person I think in any movie I've ever watched. Plus, I think the fact that they decided to send every citizen of Nottingham to debtor's prison is really funny, because now your source of income is totally gone. How are they gonna make more money for you if they're all locked up, dumbass? I'd be lying if I said it was interesting the whole time, but unlike the Aristocats from 3 years prior, there's always something happening, and that's something I didn't fully appreciate the first time I watched this. Robin Hood is just pretty fun. The Rooster is still my favorite character, and the movie still peaked with the song that he sings at the very beginning, but the overall picture is definitely better than I remember. It surprisingly got some charm to it, and I'd consider it pretty good, and if they didn't spend half the movie making fun of Prince John sucking his thumb, I'd even consider it great. It's not that funny. It just isn't that funny. Stop making this joke. It's dumb.
Oh, Obi-Doo, I wanna be like you.
The Jungle Book is the last movie that Walt Disney made before he died, and it really kind of feels that way. The Golden Age, Silver Age, and especially the wartime era all struggled with taking a story that's basically composed of some characters walking around, singing, and meeting even more characters, and turning that into something that's actually enjoyable to watch the whole way through. But I'm glad Walt was able to make the stars align at least once before he died, because even though this is definitely a movie where plot is secondary and not much really happens, it still has enough other stuff going for it that it literally doesn't even matter. The jungle is absolutely beautiful in this movie. They really toned the Xerox down in the backgrounds and allowed things to have the detail they deserve. This one shot by the waterfall would just not look as good if it had the same set design as like 101 Dalmatians. The vibe of this movie just doesn't really mesh with that, and they knew that. The characters are the only pencil sketch looking aspect, but that's way less intrusive, especially here, and I don't think it looks too out of place. Everything is just really fluid, or at least fluid enough for every single scene with Baloo to be stolen for that scene in Robin Hood, and how good everything looks just makes patrolling the jungle for 80 minutes way more fun. Look how cool of a set piece this temple is. I like pretty much all of the characters that we meet, Bagheera and Baloo for sure, but King Louie is also a great secondary character, even though he may or may not be an African-American caricature. Honestly, to me, he seems more like an Adam Sandler caricature than anything else with his weird gibberish noises, but you know, I could definitely be convinced. Kaa has really grown on me too, because he's voiced by Winnie the Pooh. Colonel Hathi and the elephants are a nice inclusion, and Shere Khan is an acceptable villain too. Pretty much all of the side characters that we meet are just genuinely really memorable, and when I rewatched this, I kept having moments where I was like, oh my god, it's that guy. I remember that guy from the last time I watched the hit movie The Jungle Book. Remember that guy? Mowgli doesn't really have any defining features, but the movie doesn't really require him to. I will admit that by the end, the formula of go to place, meet person, go to place, meet person that this type of Disney movie follows did get a bit stale, and I'm never going to love or remember these Beatles vultures as much as any of the others, but that's okay, because from start to finish, the main characters all have distinct personalities that we're given time to see. In a movie with no plot, you kind of need good characters, you know? But it seems like Disney did know that and let the characters of the characters be brought to the forefront of the story. Throughout the film, their jokes make what would normally be boring scenes way more entertaining. We grow to like all of our protagonists, and the fact that all of the obstacles they face for the first 65 minutes out of the total 80 are all enjoyable just makes the pacing even better, and the end of the movie really does feel kind of right. The idea of Mowgli deciding to join the human village because girl is kind of eye-roll inducing, but they made the scene in such a way that I honestly can't think of a better way to conclude the movie. A lot of the songs are fantastic too. A lot of them aren't really, but there are so many memorable, great songs in this movie, and plus, that opening song slaps. To be honest, that's all there is to say about The Jungle Book. It doesn't have the strongest plot in the world, or even any real plot, but everything looks amazing, the soundtrack is pretty good, and the solid cast of characters makes this kind of circuitous movie one of my favorites from the Silver Age. Well, you know, top half of the Silver Age anyway. From May 2022 all the way to January 2023, the movie in first place on my ranking was The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, and even though I'm not quite sure why in retrospect, this movie still slaps and more people should watch it. I feel like the scene with the Headless Horseman is the only reason anyone even remembers this movie, but to be honest, the entire thing is just genuinely entertaining. The first short is The Wind in the Willows, and I have to say, it's one of the most enjoyable shorts that Disney has ever put out, mainly because of how absolutely insane it is. This short cannot follow a cohesive plot to save its life, and it's more entertaining than I can possibly describe. What starts as two friends trying to stop their other friend from making reckless decisions quickly turns into a courtroom drama when Toad gets arrested for Grand Theft Auto, which quickly turns into a solemn story about a guy locked away in prison after Toad botches the trial so badly that he ends up immediately getting incriminated. This quickly turns into a prison escape, where Toad dresses up as an old lady as the police follow on a train, firing bullets by the hundreds, and this quickly turns into a heist film where all of the main characters have to steal a MacGuffin to prove Toad's innocence and save the day. As a general rule of thumb, these sort of weird, incoherent plots don't usually work. Believe me, Don Bluth tried. If it was a genuinely consistent method of storytelling, A Troll in Central Park would have won Academy Awards, but Disney actually put in the effort to make this enjoyable. There are through lines that make all of these disparate plot elements fit together, and so instead of feeling like a jumbled mess, it feels like the most exciting mess you've ever had the pleasure of watching. The tonal whiplash you will get while watching this movie is very hard to replicate. That sounds like a bad thing, but trust me, it definitely isn't. It's so good that I think I almost prefer it to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but that's obviously not to say that the second short in this movie is bad, far from it. Ichabod is the most handsome and charismatic guy to ever be put on your TV screens, and I'm not just saying that just to like be stupid or whatever. It's a canonical and actually kind of essential part of the movie. Watching Great Value Gaston try to screw over Ichabod in the most ridiculous ways to try to win the girl's favor, only to fail utterly and completely, may be a plot that's been used before, but it's done great here. And I don't even know if it matters anyway, because this movie probably predates 99% of the stuff that made it a cliche to begin with. And obviously, the Headless Horseman scene absolutely rocks. There's a ton of other worthwhile stuff in this movie, but if you had to pick one scene to remember, yeah, it'd have to be this one. The action is intense and exciting, it uses animation to its fullest extent, and it ends up creating a chase sequence that feels distinctly cartoonish, but still feels sinister and evil. It's just really cool to watch, and the fact that Ichabod literally dies at the end makes it even better. The animation is good, the songs are better, it's exciting the whole way through, the characters are entertaining, the story is either not here at all or here way too much, I honestly can't decide. The Sleepy Hollow short is narrated by Bing Crosby, and The Wind in the Willows short is narrated by Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is a certified epic movie. It may not be my favorite anymore, and to be completely fair, I doubt that it ever was, but it's still a really fun time that you should definitely check out.
Santa?
Scott Calvin.
I have now returned from my 2 weeks of AP exams, so that was really fun. Anyway, we are now halfway done with the list. That's pretty cool. We can say with pretty much complete certainty that we're well into the good movies by now. Everything from here on out, and probably the last 10 or so we've already done, are ones you should at least check out. And Santa Claus is Coming to Town is pretty good. Definitely my least favorite of the actually good Rankin and Best stop motion movies, but that's really not saying that much. And speaking of really not saying that much, I don't really have that much to say on this movie. I think the plot is really good. I happen to really like Santa origin stories that go out of their way to explain how he ended up doing all of the things we know him for, like putting toys in stockings and getting into houses through chimneys. Klaus did it, and I think that movie's great. Not on this list, sadly. And this movie does it, and I also think this movie's great. Is it Klaus or Claus? It's spelled with a K, so I feel like it's Klaus. I've watched the movie, I should know the answer to this question. Young Santa is just really likable, and watching him come into his own as the opposition to him spreading happiness increases is just cool to watch. He also has a love interest that isn't there just because, and that's also pretty cool to see, and Burgermeister Meisterburger is a phenomenal villain. I don't think there's anything I could possibly say that could change your mind if you somehow don't agree, because like, at that point you're clearly too far gone, no notes. There's also a secondary villain, the Winter Warlock, and even though he definitely has no reason to be in this movie, the scene where young Santa teaches him how to be happy again is classic, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. Which seems like a nice opportunity to mention the main thing that everyone likes about all these old Christmas movies, the fact that we all first saw them as kids. That's it. It helps that they're all quality movies anyway, but the simple fact that pretty much everybody has an overwhelming sense of nostalgia toward these movies makes them even better, and that nostalgia is totally deserved. This movie and all of these movies are super charming. The stop motion allows for all of the characters to just show their emotions so openly. You know that joke that's in like every movie where some people are talking and think that like John is somewhere else, but he's actually right there and they don't know it, so they look over at John and say, "Oh hey John." Well, John?
That silly snowman. Once they come to life, they don't know nothing. Come to life?
Yeah, that happens all the time in these movies, but the fact that all of the characters have their own unique mannerisms makes it even more charming, and what's even more charming than all of that is the songs. Every single one of these movies has amazing songs, to the point where some of them I didn't even realize were from this movie, and they had just transcended to the level of Christmas song. If You Sit on My Lap Today, One Foot in Front of the Other, The First Toy Maker to the King, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, the namesake of the film. I'm actually kind of dense for not realizing that that song was from this movie, but like, whatever. These are the songs behind some of the most memorable scenes, not just in this movie, but in like any movie, and this isn't the only movie where this is the case, especially because this isn't the only movie where Mickey Rooney plays Santa Claus, and good thing too, because he nails it every time. Guess I have more to say than I thought, but to be honest, this whole review is just kind of restating the obvious. Santa Claus is Coming to Town speaks for itself, and honestly, so do all of the Christmas movies to come.
Come on, son, and get a going, get them apple trees a-growing, there's a lot of work out there to do. Oh, there's a lot of work to do.
You know what? I'm willing to fight for Melody Time. Make Mine Music, everyone agrees, is pretty good, but this movie, Melody Time, is easily the most underrated movie from the wartime era. It was the package film from this time period that I was most excited to rewatch for this video. It sounds weird, but it was the one I was the most nostalgic for, and now that I've watched it again, yeah, Melody Time is actually really good. There's a ton of bad stuff, but there's so much more fantastic stuff to balance it out, and to fully cover all of it, you guessed it, it's time for a ranking. Number 7, Once Upon a Winter Time is just a lot of nothing, kinda. It's essentially two white people going on a sleigh ride, that's it. The guy keeps trying to impress the girl with various winter shenanigans, except then he shenanigans too hard and covers her in snow, which pisses her off. Oh no, now they'll never get together. I'll never recover from this. Now how do you think this ends? What do you think happens next? If you guessed that the guy does a grand display to apologize and regain the girl's favor, you would be smarter than the movie, because what actually happens is the girl almost falls down a waterfall and the guy has to save her, and then they fall in love. The setting isn't anything special and the animation is honestly pretty minimal. The guy turns blue when he's sad for like 10 seconds and that's the only creative thing present. It's just not very good, but the fact that the worst this movie has to offer is kind of boring is a pretty good sign. Number 6, Trees. It's a song about trees, or technically just a poem about trees, which is objectively worse, and we look at some trees and the whole thing is basically just trees. What does that mean? Just trees. That's all you need to know, because that's all there is to say. It's just 3 minutes of trees. When a short starts with the words "a tribute to trees," you know it's gonna be dumb, and it does not disappoint. Still not boring though, because it's just not long enough for there to be anything to be bored of. Good thing the trees look nice. Wait, trees? There are trees in this short? If only someone had told me. By the way, I said the word trees 10 times just then. Number 5, Blame It on the Samba is just the Three Caballeros 2 Depraved Waterfowl Boogaloo. It's the same abstract nonsense, the same three birds, the same Latin American influences, the same random live-action women and all of the weird degeneracy that comes along with it, and the same traumatic flashbacks for me. I can't really give an objective opinion on this short, because in my mind, anything related to the three gay caballeros has been permanently stained. Why did Disney just not want to let this go? Obviously nothing can compare to the last part of the original Three Caballeros, which is still one of the worst things I've ever seen, but the fact that this exists at all tells us that Disney genuinely didn't see a problem with it even after they made it, and that's really something. Number 4, Pecos Bill. Yeah, they pronounce it Pecos. That seems really strange to me, but whatever. It's the longest short, and it's kind of a perfect middle ground to end off the movie. This is just the folktale of Pecos Bill doing a bunch of random things and accidentally creating the entire continent of North America in the process. It all happens over the course of one song, and it's pretty good. It has that old-timey Disney feel, and it's just a pretty entertaining sequence. Then he falls in love with this girl, but on their wedding day, Pecos Bill's horse kicks her up in the air. But since she's wearing whatever this thing is called, every time she hits hits the ground, she somehow bounces higher than she did the previous time, ending with her literally being on the moon. That is so funny, and they do it with absolutely no sexism at any point.
Aw, shucks, a woman in the story.
But what a woman.
And I see they were on top of their racism game too. Overall, the desert looks nice, it's pretty enjoyable, and I like the skeleton bird who says the word water. Number 3, Little Toot. Maybe my most controversial placement on this list, if people actually had opinions about this movie. This is about a small boat who wants to be a tugboat, but he can't because he's small. But then he learns that he can, and that's the whole story, and it takes 10 minutes to happen. I like that the first time he tries to be a tugboat, he fails so miserably that he practically causes 9/12, causing him to become a social outcast. And it's not like the story of him redeeming himself by finally finding the strength to be a tugboat in the most dire situation is inherently bad. If it was, we wouldn't see stories just like it literally everywhere. My only problem with it originally was that it was too long and therefore too boring, but this time I was surprised by how quick it felt, so I actually don't mind it at all. Number 2, Bumble Boogie. Of all the abstract stuff that Disney made during the wartime era, Bumble Boogie is probably the best one. The only way a jazz cover of Flight of the Bumblebee could get better is if you somehow added the most perfect and insane visuals of all time to amplify the music 100-fold. Oh wait, that's exactly what they did. This cute little bee guy trying to escape some sort of weird musical alternate universe that bebops along with the music is exactly the creativity I wanted. I don't mind things that just show off animation. It's just that a lot of the animation that does get shown off on its own isn't really worth being shown off on its own, but this is. It's probably the best abstract thing set to music that Disney has ever made, at least that I've seen. Fantasia wishes it could be this stupendously magnificent. And number 1, the story of Johnny Appleseed. I don't know what it is about this short that makes me actually love it, but after rewatching it, the fact that I do love it is now sort of entirely out of the question. This one is unique because it actually has a real story that is the actual real focus of the short. The plot itself is really good and I really love it, but equally important, the animation is good, and that actually is equally important in this case. The lively parties, the vast fields of trees spanning the entire continent, Johnny's character design, all of his designs actually, all the way down to the small details, add a special magic touch to every scene in this short. This short ends with Johnny as an old man. He's been planting apple trees his whole life, and so he goes to sleep under a tree and wakes up as a ghost. And then he goes to start planting apple trees in heaven, and that's how we have clouds. I feel like Disney actually had a sort of plan when making this one, which is more than I can say for the other American folklore-themed short in this movie. Even the songs are great, and I mean great. Seriously, every single song in this short actually unironically slaps. Just like with Santa Claus is Coming to Town, the songs are so memorable that they single-handedly make this movie 10 times more nostalgic. The Lord's Been Good to Me and Apple Song, yes, that's what it's called, are both unironically 10 out of 10 songs that I've hummed all the time for the last 3 months. This whole short is like the rawest and most pure form of old-time Disney magic I've ever seen. It feels like childhood, a weird description, and also a description that no one else agrees with except me, probably. But it also feels exactly perfect for how I feel. Melody Time definitely has some slower parts, like the world would be completely unchanged if this stupid-ass random tree short wasn't in the movie, but there are tons of shorts in this movie that are just insanely enjoyable to watch, and there are 2 that I actually love beyond that. Like I said at the start of this segment, I am totally willing to fight for this movie's honor, because it seriously deserves it. Of all of the Studio Ghibli movies on this list, Princess Mononoke is undeniably the most epic. This battle between humans and the gods of the forest is so cool from start to finish, and it gives us some of the most visually creative scenes in any animated movie I've ever watched. Might as well start off with the most obvious positive, the Deer God. The Deer God is essentially the main forest spirit, and he gives off a feeling in this movie that I cannot quite describe. The otherworldly and ethereal feeling that this silent and magical creature gives off in every scene he's in glues your eyes to the screen. Throughout the movie, he looks like a normal deer, a weird Nightwalker thing, an Elden Ring boss at the end, and a couple of intermediate stages too. I don't know how they managed to make a literal animal that does not say a single word or even do a single thing feels so all-knowing and wise beyond mortal comprehension, but that's exactly what they did. In fact, this one character was so cool that he single-handedly saved this movie for me the first time that I watched it. Yeah, when I checked this one out for the Studio Ghibli video, I didn't really understand what the movie was actually about. The subtitles were all wrong, and so I wasn't really sure who any of the characters were, or what any of them wanted, or why any of them were doing the things that they were doing, or what exactly the plot of the movie was, and it made a lot of scenes in the film really boring to watch, and if it wasn't for the Dear God, I probably would have originally really disliked it, but thanks to various YouTube comments, and especially a well-timed cinema therapy video, I'm now actually sort of aware of what the point of the movie is, and now I like it a lot more. It's amazing how that works. This entire movie is kind of just a giant metaphor for hatred, and how even though it's easier to just blindly continue to hate each other, it's always better to put in the extra work to find the peaceful way out. Apparently the demon sludge is basically just a personification of hatred. Every time a human kills one of the forest gods, it gets infected by the sludge because it was killed out of hate. When this happens, the end result is a giant hate monster. As the main character is slowly being killed by the sludge throughout the movie, the hate is also slowly killing him. Knowing what this movie is actually trying to say, big shocker, makes everything kind of a lot better. There's still a few scenes that could have been trimmed down a bit. I still wish the main character was slightly less immortal, and I realize that without the full English dub, which I am definitely not getting a Max subscription for, my opinions on this movie will probably not be as favorable as they could be. And everything I have said on this movie today is with the understanding that I really need to do a proper rewatch of it at some point in the future. But doesn't that make the fact that it's still this high even more impressive? At least we can all agree that the Dear God is peak cinema.
No.
Aladdin.
I am your father.
After Return of Jafar, I was kind of resigned to the fact that the Aladdin franchise and all of the Disney sequels would be ending on a sort of depressing note, but Aladdin and the King of Thieves actually very quickly proved me wrong. What a surprisingly great third movie. So many unique ideas here, so many amazing set pieces, so many seriously great character moments. Robin Williams, it has everything you could possibly want. The long-lost parent returns trope is a staple of sequels, but it's done so well here that I don't even mind. Aladdin actually acts like himself again, and seeing his dad's inner struggle of trying to do the right thing is pretty compelling to watch. The main villain is sort of lame and very forgettable, but he poses a good threat and he does all that the plot requires him to do, and his existence gives us the best climax I could have possibly asked for, where a magical city rises out of the water, housing the hand of Midas that can turn anything into gold. It may not fit with the world of Aladdin at all, but it gives us a bunch of now the father and son are going to work together moments, and it's just straight up cool. This climax is actually really enjoyable, and it helps that the pacing is much better. There are some liar revealed tropes and whatever that definitely slow some parts down, and that's a bit annoying, but for the most part, the jokes, action scenes, and more serious scenes are all interspersed pretty well. I'm not sure if the genie helps or hurts. Don't get me wrong, I'm so glad that Robin Williams came back for this movie, because I'm way less likely to care about any genie-related flaws, as long as it's clearly the genie voicing the genie, but like, there really is a lot of genie in this movie, isn't there? I used to think that the original Aladdin had too many impressions and impersonations in it, but after this movie, I completely changed my mind. In this film, Elvis shows up, Mrs. Doubtfire shows up, Forrest Gump shows up, Snow White shows up, Julius Caesar shows up. I'm not gonna bother putting them all up on screen, it's just too much at times. But to be honest, that's a pretty minor issue. Aladdin and the King of Thieves is still just a really solid, enjoyable sequel. The characters all act the way they used to, the plot actually makes sense and doesn't suck, there are emotional-ish and or tense moments. Dare I say it, it's a pretty good film. Definitely a Disney sequel that you should check out. And there are still 2 more of those on this list to go. Fair warning, I haven't timed it, but Snow White is probably the longest segment in this video. As the very first movie I ever reviewed on this channel, it's also the one that I reviewed the worst takes, worst way of presenting those takes, just flat out awful. And that really sucks because this was a really influential movie, and I wish I had taken the time to explore why, instead of reviewing it from a very surface level and very modern standpoint. And so I'm seizing this opportunity to right that wrong and do a full, official, actual re-review of Snow White. Not necessarily talking about the movie, but more about just its utter significance. This time around, I tried to watch this movie through the eyes of someone from from 1937, I thought, what was this movie originally made to be? What was animation like back then? What did people associate with Disney? What was the true purpose of Snow White? And is it a good movie as that? And rewatching this movie with those thoughts in mind made me like it so much more. I'll spoil the answer for you. Disney wanted to make a true fairy tale. A true fairy tale. A storybook come to life for all of the people of the world to see. And when you think about it like that, you start to realize how kind of perfectly they executed that vision, because this movie is probably the purest fairy tale to ever be made. This movie is meant to be the culmination of over a decade of Disney animation magic, a transcendent experience that would reshape the entire movie-making paradigm forever, something that would make people feel transported to a fairy tale world with fairy tale characters, fantastical animation, whimsical songs, the magnum opus of the studio. Now, I'm not saying that this is the studio's magnum opus anymore, but for a while there, I would argue that it absolutely was, because that whole description of what this movie was trying to accomplish that I just gave is kind of done perfectly in every way. Pretty much every part of this movie is in service of the transition from Disney mainly making cartoons to Disney making full animated movies, using the past to pave the way for the future. And what better place to start to illustrate this than the evil queen, the ultimate fairy tale villain. She's so obsessed with becoming the fairest in the land that she goes out of her way to disfigure herself just to kill a girl that she's jealous of. This girl is like 15. She literally dies in the process of trying to make sure that this random innocent child stays dead. Once she found Snow White, she could have just killed her in literally any way she wanted, but she still put in the extra effort to be creative. That's not some sort of issue with the movie, that's a cinema sins plot hole. The evil queen is so petty and malicious because that's just who she is. That's just definitive fairy tale stuff. Like every other character in the movie, she is the way that she is so that the movie will feel more like a look into a magical world. Sure, the evil queen could have just taken out like a rapier and just stabbed Snow White 10 times in the chest, but that wouldn't have been very magical, would it? Huh? And on a side note, how do you make an old lady look so distinctive? There are hundreds of people who look exactly like this on every street corner in every major city in the world, and yet I feel like this design is even more iconic than her actual queen design. If you need another example of a perfect fairy tale character, try Snow White herself. You can actually all day long about how Snow White is an idiot for taking an apple from this random old lady, and how all of the stuff with this flat as a board Prince Florian is really bland and poorly aged. But the truth is, this is a German folktale. Disney did not invent this character, nor did they invent this story. And even though she doesn't really have any defining traits, and she's kind of foolish for walking into some random house in the middle of the forest, I cannot illustrate enough, I cannot emphasize enough how little that matters. In fact, I'd say it helps. The entire point of Snow White as a character is that she is this infallibly good, perfect, wholesome, innocent person. The fairest person of all the people, if you will. And she is. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't walk into a random house in the woods and start cleaning it, but do you know why she does it? She sees that the chairs are small, so she assumes they're children, which isn't an unreasonable thing to think, and she sees that everything is dirty, so she assumes they have no mother and must be orphans. She cleans this house because she is just that kind. She does it out of the kindness of her own heart, because she has one character trait, and it's being the most innocent and perfect person to ever live. And that's what they do. And it's not even like she's dumb. She's able to guess which dwarves are which pretty fast. She calls them on not washing their hands almost immediately. She's actually pretty competent in this story, except for the apple thing. Even if the dwarfs never showed up, she could have lived by herself in that house forever. Where did she get the ingredients to make dinner? I don't know, man, but she still made dinner. Every mistake she makes is from being naive and believing the best in everyone, not from being stupid. And when you think of it like that, golly gee, it makes her seem like way less of an insult to women. And the way that this movie is animated and paced makes it feel like a feature-length Disney cartoon, which makes sense, because guess what? That's what the audience was used to seeing. I mean, Snow White thinking the trees are alive and trying to eat her, that's something you could see in a Mickey Mouse cartoon. Well, I can't sleep in the ground like you. Nope. And I can't sleep in a tree like you. Nope. You kind of see what I mean? It has that Mickey Mouse goofiness to it, and I feel like the hand-washing scene with the dwarfs could straight up be its own short. It just all feels like Disney, or at least like what Disney felt like back then. The same way of telling stories that everyone knew and loved and expected from this studio was still here in this movie, just expanded into the length of an entire feature film. That's also why the, hey, why do they show off animation so much argument doesn't even work here at all, because like, what do you mean? The first ever animated feature film is gonna show off animation. That's a given. Imagine living in a world where the only animated things you've ever seen are Steamboat Willie and like Through the Mirror, and now you're watching literally 90 straight minutes of pure cartoon magic in one continuous story. This is what the movie was made to do, get people into animation. Why is that such a bad thing? And I don't even know if it messes up the movie from a modern standpoint either. All of the cute, magical, whimsical scenes that you associate with the charm of Snow White are here because this is the first fully animated feature film of all time. All of the cute, sort of old-fashioned, nostalgic details are nostalgic and old-fashioned because this is the first fully animated feature film of all time. Obviously, the story doesn't hold up amazingly, but that's so okay, because it's not what this movie was ever made to do. There's a story, and it's good, but most of this movie is just animated cartoon goodness, and it's great, and that's why it's so nostalgic. This movie knows what it is, and just does it. And the result is the super charming movie we all know. Of course, I'm not going to pretend that there aren't some issues, mainly Snow White's face, which somehow invented Uncanny Valley about 80 years too early, but everything else looks seriously great. The dwarf's house feels really cozy, and all of the magic stuff has great designs to it. That potion mixing scene still holds up and looks amazing to this day, and the evil queen catching lightning in her goblet is such an awesome shot, and every single song in this movie is just... like, there isn't even a word for it, and you don't need a word for it, because you just already know what I'm talking about. Hi-ho, Someday My Prince Will Come, I'm Wishing, Whistle While You Work. These are like the anthems of Disney World for a reason. They are just the anthems of, like, animation. And there's a reason. If I play you this... you can immediately see what part of the movie it's from. This is one aspect of the film that I really don't see a point in overanalyzing. The songs are just all amazing, we know. I want to end this segment off by talking about Through the Mirror, one of my favorite Mickey Mouse cartoons ever. I haven't seen that many, but of the ones I've seen, this is one of my favorites. Do you know why? It's for all of the same reasons that I now like this movie. There is essentially no plot for the entire middle section of this short. Mickey just dances around with some household objects, and I literally love it. It has that cartoon goodness. Trying to say that it sucks because all it does is show off animation would be ridiculous, because that's not really taking into account what the short really is. And you know where I'm going with this here. Snow White was made to be a feature-length cartoon, because that's what people in 1937 were expecting. And this time around, when I made sure to look at it the same way, I was able to see what made this movie take over America, what made it the magnum opus of Walt Disney Animation Studios for at least like 50 years. Who knew that trying to understand the audience, purpose, context, and exigence for this movie would make me do a complete 180 and like it this much? This is genuinely the only good thing that taking AP Lang ever did for me. Pinocchio has one of the most scatterbrained plots of any Disney movie, and that's exactly why I like it. Yes, the movie is super racist toward Native Americans and Italians and black people probably, because it's always black people, and temporarily every other race too. And yes, Pinocchio drinks and smokes and says the word jackass. And yes, the thing with the kids getting turned into donkeys and being sold into slavery is very weird and disturbing. I know this is like 1940, but I could have done without all of those things. But the rest of the movie is such pure, entertaining randomness that I was never bored. Like, there's one point where Pinocchio has just escaped Pleasure Island, and he's making his way back to Geppetto's house, only to get there and immediately see a letter that says he was eaten by a whale. So then he immediately leaves Geppetto's house to go save him. It feels like even the movie doesn't know what's going to happen next. And normally that would work against it, but here it just makes it even more believable that Pinocchio would get sort of overwhelmed and make some bad choices. I'd probably get overwhelmed and make some bad choices here, and I'm like a lot older than Pinocchio by like all of my age, because he's like 2 days old, and the insane things that happen as a result are so much fun. Pinocchio is kind of a blank slate of a character, but I'm fine with that since, if you forgot, him being young and impressionable is literally the whole point of the movie. I do wish he had more of like an arc though. He spends about an hour doing whatever he wants to, and then he does one selfless act and instantly proves to the Blue Fairy that he's kind-hearted, and that doesn't seem quite right, especially because that one selfless act he barely even contributed to. It was mostly just luck that he and Geppetto happened to wash up on shore. Plus, the thing with his nose growing only happens in one scene. That's like Pinocchio's whole thing. I just wish this movie about a kid growing a conscience had any conscience growing in it. And I like Geppetto a lot too. I like his design. I like that he sleeps with a gun under his pillow. I like that he keeps thinking he's hallucinating Pinocchio. And I like that that happens multiple times.
Who's there?
It's me.
Oh, it's me.
Father!
Don't bother me now, Pinocchio. Pinocchio.
Father! What you crying for?
Because you're dead, Pinocchio.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you are.
My guy, I think you might need to go to ye olde urgent care. There are fewer songs in this movie, but that's okay, especially because all of the ones that are here are really good. There's a reason why When You Wish Upon a Star is like Disney's main theme now. What else is there to say? I mean, the animation is pretty good. All of the underwater stuff and just the water physics in general are really impressive. And the scene where they're getting chased by Monstro, I'm not even sure how they did. Pleasure Island is a horrifying idea, but it's really detailed. It looks like that one Cuphead boss, and I like it. And Pinocchio's village is a really good feel. Certainly feels cozier than the one in the movie made 2 years ago. Just like with Snow White, and just like with a lot of the movies to come out after this, you can tell that just showing off some nice moving pictures was a primary goal, which is why we have this whole, like, 3-minute scene of a wall full of cuckoo clocks. Like I've said, I used to really hate this, but looking at it through the same lens I used to watch Snow White, it makes the whole thing just a lot more enjoyable. And these scenes cut into the actual story way less than they actually do in Snow White, which I think was a good choice, since this and that were trying to accomplish different things. Pinocchio is a pretty weird movie, and that's why it's so great. I debated for a while on whether or not to put this above Snow White, and I guess it doesn't really matter because it's only just above Snow White, but I guess, in general, it is the superior movie. Well, I guess I have to be the one to stand up for Tarzan here. It may not be the greatest by Disney Renaissance standards, but it's still perfectly serviceable and really enjoyable by movie standards. Oh no, I can't believe we had like a 7 out of 10 movie in the middle of a bunch of 10 out of 10 movies. This is literally the worst movie ever made. It's like, do you hear what you're saying right now? To be fair, it took me a while to realize this for myself. Yes, if Disney had just allowed the characters to sing instead of all of the songs being performed by the ethereal voice of Phil Collins, I would probably be a bit more invested in the story. It's definitely true that I can't get like as invested in Tarzan or Jane as I probably would if they had some songs, even though that's kind of an unprovable fact. And if the side characters had a song, maybe Turk would be 1% less annoying.
The fun has arrived. Thank you very much.
Actually, that's probably impossible. But that's not to say that the lack of those songs now makes me fully unable to care about the story. Because the more I think about it, the more I realize that I actually really, really like this movie. Disney still put in the effort to make sure we know what all of the characters want. I don't need a song to understand that Tarzan probably wants to know more about the humans. Jane doesn't need to sing about how she wants to know more about Tarzan. We don't need a giant love ballad between Tarzan and Jane talking about the connection they feel between them when we have this scene where they do that hand thing that, let's be honest, is pretty good at showing that message even without a song. Movies without songs exist, and they have themes. Songs are not 100% necessary, and we don't need a song for us to realize that Kerchak and Tarzan don't get along. I can't believe it. They don't get along. I never would have guessed without a song. Or that Clayton is a bad person who probably doesn't let ethics affect his decision-making all too much. Well, I don't know. We don't have a song, so how can we be sure he's a bad person? Would songs make these things better? A lot of them maybe, but this isn't a Mulan 2020 situation where the things those songs accomplished were left unreplaced. We get scenes of tension between Tarzan and Kerchak. We get scenes of Jane being curious about Tarzan. We get scenes of Clayton being an unapologetic asshole. If you would prefer diegetic songs in this movie, that's fine. Probably so would I, but let's not pretend we're left with some sort of soulless abomination because the person singing the songs isn't a character in the movie, and it's not even like the songs are bad either. It could be because I grew up with this movie, but I love this soundtrack. These songs are just as great as the rest of the Renaissance songs. Not a single one is below 9 out of 10. You'll Be in My Heart is still a good song, even when it's being sung by a balding white guy. Son of Man is an absolute bop that, to be honest, probably makes more sense in the movie this way, because who the hell would be singing this song? And Strangers Like Me, and the scene that goes along with it, is probably the part of this movie that I remember most. I wouldn't call it a magical experience or anything, but I think it still captures the curiosity that both Tarzan and Jane have during this scene. The direction and the lighting just make it just so interesting. Yes, the part where the gorillas assassinate Mrs. Potts and create this cacophony of random sounds probably cannot be saved, but like, songs are here, the songs are good, and we care enough about all of the characters. We clearly understand the dynamics between everyone in the story. The emotional moments still have decent weight behind them, and I was still able to care about the events that were unfolding. So I ask you, what about this movie would be different with in-universe songs? Not improved, but fundamentally different. The way I see it, not enough to make a huge change in the movie's overall quality. I still have my fair share of issues with it, like the first 5 minutes with the Jaguar are Oscar winning, they're scary, they're intense, all the elements of this broken treehouse are used really well, and it's overall really great. It really looked like it was going to be the main antagonist of the movie, but then it got killed in the first scene with Tarzan as an adult. I didn't realize it was that early, but it was literally the first scene. Also, I definitely agree with the argument that Kerchak should not have forgiven Tarzan. His death scene was sad, but only as long as you don't think too hard about, wait, why is he suddenly forgiving him here? And the racism metaphor that may or may not be somewhere in this movie does kind of get muddled by the fact that it's between humans and monkeys. Because that's a connotation that's been around for much longer than 25 years. Also this, which definitely wasn't intentional, but is certainly present in the film. And Turk is still incredibly annoying, and I wish she didn't exist. He? She? I don't even know. But in general, I still really... Whoa, that was crazy. But in general, I still really like watching this movie. There are a ton of really fun scenes, the animation's amazing, and the 3D-esque stuff they were able to pull off is really impressive and still holds up today, and most importantly, it still works as a story and as a movie, even without the songs that had held Disney's films together for 10 straight years. Could it have been better? Sure. Is it as good as the stuff directly before it? No, not really. But is it a win? Is it a good movie? I would say yes. Man, the Swan Princess is still so awesome. It's the last movie in B tier, and I really did deliberate for a while on whether or not to bump it up to A tier. I don't quite think so, but A, my opinion might and probably will change, and B, that doesn't detract from how much fun this movie is to watch. This really is a great movie. People sleep on it because, like, well, it sounds kind of bad, but this feels just as much like a fairy tale as Snow White, albeit for completely different reasons. And yes, as yet another movie from the last video, I'm probably going to be moving through this one pretty quick since my thoughts on it are very well chronicled and only a few months old. Pretty much all there is to say is that the plot has a cool idea behind it and the characters are insanely likable and help that plot get executed to the best of its ability. But even though that's basically all there is to say, doesn't mean I couldn't go on about that at length, because I have. TLDR, this movie is about Derek and Odette. They're about to get married, but Derek fumbles the ball, and before he can fix things, an evil sorcerer kidnaps Odette and essentially ties her soul to this lake. As long as the moonlight touches the lake, she stays human, but at all other times, she's a swan. And the movie is the two main characters trying to get back to each other and break the curse. And yes, I said the two main characters. Odette is not useless in this movie. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. The female character is not useless. In fact, she's probably more useful than Derek is, and the conflict would not have been resolved if not for her. I can say that with 100% certainty. She's constantly testing the limits of this curse, and it allows the movie to really explore the idea in some genuinely creative ways. There's some really smart stuff in this movie, and it creates some seriously tense moments. The pacing is really good, and all the more side quest feeling scenes still make sense in the story. Plus, they only exist in moderation, and they're all still really enjoyable. The fact that this movie has not one and not two, but 3 animal sidekicks, and somehow not a single one is annoying, is telling enough that I probably don't even have to continue, but I will, because the animation is also amazing. All of the character designs are great. All of the castle exteriors and interiors are beautiful. The backgrounds have a really pretty watercolor vibe to them, and it really makes the world feel more alive and full. We know that the Lake Odette is tied to is some unspecified long distance away, but you can actually see that visually. The forests look different, and not just because of the time of day, they're actually distinct places, and that's really cool. And the songs, there is a reason I saved this part for last. Not only are the songs good, but they're actually great. This is my idea, is a really smart way to start the movie, showing Derek and Odette growing up and slowly starting to fall in love. It's really cute, and I'm very glad that the movie wasn't just about this, instead putting it in the first 5 minutes and having the plot be something more interesting. 10 out of 10 song. And far longer than Forever. 11 out of 10 song. This song is peak. A love song sung in sync by 2 people dozens of miles apart. And boy do they sing in sync.
Like no love ever known.
Am I the only one who's impressed by how in sync that is? If you took out one of those online tuning apps, I guarantee they would be playing the same hertz sound. It is that in sync. The Swan Princess is by far one of the most underrated princess movies I've seen. Every character is good, every new plot element is great, the songs are even better than great. I don't love the movie, but it's definitely up there as a slightly below average Disney Renaissance adjacent film. That sounds like a backhanded compliment, but it really isn't. Totally watch this movie at some point, and if you have kids, make this a priority for them to watch. Right up there with the greats. There's one category of movies in this video that's very unlike the rest, and that is the old Christmas movies. Usually that doesn't stop me from ranking them alongside the others, but for 4 Christmas movies in particular, it does. The 4 Christmas classics that felt wrong to take off the list but are still so short that they cannot really be compared to the rest of the stuff in the video, and so we have this little mini tier. I did something like this in my video ranking all of the Mario Kart 8 tracks, where there were a few tracks, coincidentally also 4, that I felt like couldn't really be compared to the rest of the tracks, and so I made a separate tier for them, and now I'm doing it again. So it's time for Christmas tier. Holly and jolly, but very small-ly. Instead of doing full-on reviews for each of these, we'll kind of just do one mega review for all of them. So here is 38, 37, 36, and 35. Starting with number 38, The Little Drummer Boy. This one is definitely the worst. The stop motion is the most choppy here, the characters are the least charming, the plot is the least memorable, it is the most racist, and the part where the sheep gets run over by that chariot is objectively the best part. Then we have number 37, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. The Little Drummer Boy is the only one of these 4 that I don't really think is that good. This one may be weak, but it's still charming and I still like it. The fact that they managed to take a poem with absolutely no substance, because it's literally just a guy flexing his vocabulary, and somehow turned it into an original story with some pretty nice Christmassy themes, is actually really impressive. The animation is not the best, but that's fine, because it still has tons of that Rankin and Bass quirkiness, I guess, to it that makes it so nostalgic on rewatch, and the songs are awesome. I can say this about all 4 of these, even The Little Drummer Boy probably, but still, even A Miracle Needs a Hand was never one I really cared for when I was younger, but then again, neither was this movie in general, and now I think it's really good. Cool little short film thingy, nice ideas in it, some cool characters, and I don't know why this town of humans coexists with a bunch of sentient mice. Number 36, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. This is probably tied with the Charlie Brown holiday movies for the most iconic Christmas television ever made. You watched this during Christmas. Do not lie to me. Your parents watched this during Christmas. Maybe their parents did. Maybe their parents did. I don't know what your family looks like. This one wasn't made by Rankin and Bass, but it was written and adapted by Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, and that is literally the same exact thing. You've read Dr. Seuss, your parents did, their parents did, blah blah blah, two-car garage, etc, etc. I don't need to explain why the kooky and whimsical land of Whoville, with the roast beast, and Cindy Lou Who, and the Too Small for a Mouse, and the Boris Karloff song, and the cannibalism theory are all so well remembered. Well, maybe the cannibalism theory isn't as well remembered, but I remember it. This isn't even 30 minutes long, and so you might not realize it, but it ends up being that basically every frame of this movie is iconic in some way. You know this frame here? Yeah, so does literally everyone else. That's my point. And number 35, Frosty the Snowman. Everything I've said about the other three, just way better. I like the main song more. Every single frame might not be as iconic, but I think the characters are better, and that makes the emotional moments sadder. I love the villain with every cell in my body, and silly, silly, silly is something that I have unironically quoted before. Plus, I think the pacing is better, and it's more focused than the Grinch too. Seriously, trying to compare any of these things to each other is kind of pointless, but you can probably see, and that's kind of why I'm doing it like this in the first place. The truth is, none of these are 38th, 37th, 36th, or 35th place on this ranking. They're not really anywhere else on the ranking either. They've kind of transcended being criticized. These four especially. They're a part of society's just collective consciousness at this point. Did Darth Vader being Luke's father really fit with where the story of Star Wars was heading back in 1980? I don't know, and I also don't care, and no one cares, because it just doesn't even matter anymore. It's something that just is, and people like it, and people like it so much that it always will be something that just is. Pretty much all of these old Christmas things are things that just are, but these really short ones especially just cannot be compared to anything else. But there you go, I talked about them now, so on to A tier. 2 more tiers left and like 2 more hours left in the video. But that is actually for another time, because like 10 weeks later, a whole month later than I was hoping to get this out, I've gotten out part 2. Here it is. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, see ya.